At 9:42 in the morning on June 19th in the year 1944, Major Robert Morton Niemann crouched inside his M4 Sherman on the island of Saipan, watching Japanese gunners shift their aim toward his advancing tank company as they crossed open ground toward fortified enemy positions roughly 200 yards ahead. He was 32 years old, already a Navy Cross recipient, and he commanded C Company of the 4th Tank Battalion. Ahead of him, Japanese forces had placed at least 12 75mm anti-tank guns inside concrete bunkers that dominated the approach to the ridge. These guns were supported by heavy mortars and machine gun nests dug deep into the volcanic rock. Niemann felt the heat inside the turret rise past 100 degrees, and sweat poured from his loader as the Sherman lurched forward along with 11 other tanks from his company. They advanced nearly 70 yards before a massive shock slammed into the rear of the tank and hurled Niemann against the turret wall. A large caliber round had struck the engine compartment, which filled instantly with thick black smoke. Machine gun fire stitched across the hull as his crew bailed out through the hatches. Niemann ran 40 yards to the second tank in his platoon, climbing into the commander's hatch, while bullets sparked against the armor. The new tank pushed ahead another 30 yards until the left track detonated a buried landmine. The Sherman jerked violently to the right, and Niemann smashed into the gun breech with enough force to crack 2 ribs. His driver fought the controls, but the track was gone with 70-pound links scattered across the volcanic ash, leaving the tank dead in place. Niemann ordered the crew to abandon the crippled vehicle, and he sprinted back under mortar fire toward a third Sherman, idling 20 yards behind them. He climbed inside, took command, and ordered the driver to advance. This time, they managed to break through the Japanese line. His gunner took out 2 machine gun bunkers and a mortar pit, allowing the Marines to push past the ridge. The attack was a success, but the price was severe. By nightfall, C Company had lost 6 Sherman tanks and 14 tank crewmen were killed or wounded. And this was only one day in the brutal struggle for Saipan. The 4th Marine Division had landed 4 days earlier with 68 tanks, and in less than a week Japanese mines and anti-tank guns had already taken out 23 of them, nearly 1/3 of the division's armored strength. Niemann began studying the pattern of losses, and he saw the same threat again and again. Mines. The Japanese had seeded every approach with anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, and improvised explosives built from aircraft bombs. Marine engineers attempted to clear lanes using metal detectors, but the process was slow and dangerous because they worked under constant enemy fire, and there were never enough engineers to keep up with the tanks. Many tanks outran the cleared lanes and struck mines that immobilized or destroyed them. Niemann knew the battalion needed a faster way to breach minefields. Months earlier, he had read about British mine flail tanks described in an armored force journal that had reached Maui. The British Scorpion and Crab designs used rotating chains to detonate mines before the tank rolled over them. But the Marines had nothing like that because British flail equipment remained in Europe, supporting the battles around Normandy, and the Pacific forces usually received whatever equipment the army no longer needed. After Saipan, the 4th Marine Division returned to Maui for rest and rebuilding. During the late months of 1944, intelligence began to suggest that their next target would be the island of Iwo Jima, and reports indicated the Japanese were fortifying it heavily. That meant extensive minefields awaited them, and more Marines would die unless something changed. In November, Niemann walked through the motor pool of the 4th Tank Battalion on Maui. Long rows of Sherman tanks sat under camouflage netting as mechanics worked to repair transmissions and suspensions damaged in earlier fighting. At the far end of the lot sat a battered M4, a 2-dozer tank known as Joker. It had been damaged on Saipan and removed from service. The Marine Corps was switching from diesel-powered Shermans to gasoline-powered M4A3 models, so the old diesel tank was destined for the scrap heap. Niemann stood looking at the broken dozer tank and realized it might hold the key to solving the mine problem. Niemann looked from the worn-out dozer tank to the truck yard, where maintenance crews were stripping damaged vehicles for parts, and an idea formed that was bold enough to either save hundreds of Marines or get him dismissed as a fool. The next morning, he gathered his officers and senior NCO inside the company tent and laid a rough hand-drawn sketch on the table. The drawing showed a Sherman tank with a rotating drum mounted at the front and heavy chains hanging from it. As the drum spun, the chains would strike the ground and trigger any buried mines before the tank rolled over them. His officers studied the drawing in silence. Some looked doubtful, others curious. Lieutenant Bob Reed, his executive officer, raised the main issue. How would they power such a mechanism? A tank engine drove the tracks, and most other systems ran on batteries or manual effort. Niemann admitted they did not yet know exactly how to make it work, but he believed the idea could be turned into reality with the right men and enough freedom to experiment. He asked for volunteers who were not afraid to cut into Marine Corps property and weld together equipment no technical manual had ever imagined. Gunnery Sergeant Sam Johnston stepped forward at once. He was the battalion's best mechanic, a veteran who had worked on tanks since 1941 and had kept Shermans running on Guadalcanal under conditions that ruined most machines. Johnston said he could build the device if he had Staff Sergeant Ray Shaw and full access to the vehicle graveyard. Shaw was the chief maintenance NCO, and together they had rebuilt dozens of damaged Shermans using parts scavenged from total wrecks. Niemann granted them complete authority and told them to requisition whatever they needed. For 2 days, Johnston and Shaw walked through rows of ruined vehicles seeking the right components. Aircraft parts were too delicate and tank parts too heavy for what they imagined. On the third day, they found what they needed. A destroyed 2 1/2-ton truck still had an intact rear axle and differential. The axle was roughly 6 feet wide, and the differential in the center allowed it to rotate freely, making it perfect for their purpose. They used a crane to lift it from the broken truck frame and hauled it to the motor pool. The plan became clearer with each passing day. They would weld a strong steel frame onto the front of the Joker, where the old dozer blade attachments had been. The truck axle would be mounted horizontally at the end of the frame, with the differential serving as the rotation point. Chains would be fastened along the axle, and when spun at high speed, they would strike the earth with enough force to detonate any buried mines ahead of the tank. Yet the greatest challenge remained. They needed a way to transfer power from the Sherman interior to the external flail mechanism. After more searching, Johnston discovered a solution in the wreck of a small Jeep. Its transmission was compact enough to fit inside the Sherman hull and sturdy enough to withstand intense mechanical strain. Johnston then did something that would have earned him a court-martial under normal circumstances. He cut a circular opening about 4 inches wide through the thick frontal armor of the Sherman, just left of the bow machine gun position. Through this hole, he extended a drive shaft that connected the internal Jeep transmission to the differential on the flail frame. Inside the tank, he bolted the Jeep transmission to the floor and linked it to the Sherman's drivetrain through a series of gears and belts. The bow gunner would control the entire system using one lever to engage or disengage the flail, and another to adjust its rotation speed, while the old dozer blade hydraulics would raise or lower the whole assembly. On Maui, the 127th Naval Construction Battalion was stationed nearby. These Seabees possessed skilled metal workers and advanced welding equipment capable of constructing the custom steel frame needed to support the flail. Niemann showed them the concept, and they agreed to help even though the project had no official approval. It was simply Marines assisting Marines to solve a deadly battlefield problem. Over the next week, the worksite buzzed with welding torches, ringing steel and shouted instructions, as Johnston Shaw and the Seabees cut, shaped, and assembled the strange contraption. Bit by bit, the Joker transformed from a battered dozer tank, destined for scrap, into an experimental weapon that might clear minefields the way British designs had done in Europe. Every day, Niemann visited the motor pool, watching the frame grow outward from the Sherman hull like the bones of some mechanical creature. He listened to Johnston explaining gear ratios and torque loads. He watched Shaw hammer steel plates into alignment. The idea had moved beyond theory. It was becoming a machine. Still, Niemann knew that no matter how promising it looked, everything depended on whether the flail could survive actual explosions. Chains might snap, the axle might shear away, the differential might tear apart. Any weakness would become obvious the moment the flail hit a real mine. By early December, after 3 hard weeks of work, the strange new vehicle took its final shape. It was unlike anything anyone in the battalion had ever seen. A Sherman tank with a forward-mounted truck axle that looked almost like a medieval weapon and heavy chains dangling nearly 3 feet long along its length. The hydraulics allowed the assembly to tilt up or down, and crude but strong welds held the frame together. This was ingenuity born from battlefield necessity, and Niemann knew its next test would determine whether it would save lives or become nothing more than scrap on a training field. By the beginning of December, the finished machine sat in the motor pool, looking like nothing any Marine had ever imagined a Sherman tank to be. Instead of a simple glacis plate and the shattered fittings where the dozer blade had once been mounted, the Joker now carried a long steel frame jutting forward like the arm of some armored giant, with a truck axle bolted across its end and thick chains nearly 3 feet long hanging from it. The crude armor plates welded around the differential gave the device the appearance of a steel jaw ready to shred anything standing in its path. Johnston climbed into the bow gunner position and began testing the controls. When he engaged the drive system, the Jeep transmission inside the hull caught the Sherman's power and sent it through the improvised gears and the extended drive shaft. The axle began to rotate slowly, then faster and faster, until the chains lifted from the ground in a circular blur. The sound filled the entire motor pool, a deep roaring thrum like a storm tearing through metal. Mechanics stopped their work and ran over to watch. Johnston raised the hydraulic arms, and the spinning chains rose with them. Then he lowered the assembly and let the chains touch the earth. Dirt and small stones flew outward as the rotating links pounded the ground. Everything worked exactly as designed, but no one knew whether it could survive the violent pressure of a real mine detonation. There was only one way to find out. They needed a live test. The division commander gave approval in mid-December, which was rare because senior officers almost never authorized deliberate mine explosions on training grounds. Yet the potential value was simply too great to ignore. If the flail worked, it could save countless Marines on Iwo Jima. Marine engineers prepared a test minefield half a mile from the motor pool. They buried genuine Japanese Type 93 anti-tank mines that had been captured on Saipan. These mines contained 22 pounds of explosive and could blow a Sherman track apart with ease. The engineers set them at varied depths, some shallow, some deep, some clustered together, just as real Japanese defenders would arrange them during combat. The field stretched 30 to 40 yards of deadly ground. Word of the test spread quickly. By the time Niemann and his officers arrived, nearly 100 Marines had gathered at a safe distance. Tank crewmen, mechanics, infantrymen, everyone wanted to witness whether this strange invention would either make history or explode into pieces. The Joker idled at the edge of the minefield, with Johnston positioned inside the bow gunner station and an experienced driver at the controls. Niemann stood roughly 50 yards away, knowing that everything depended on the next few minutes. If the flail failed, the entire project was over. If it succeeded, they had a weapon that could carve safe lanes through Japanese defenses. Johnston engaged the flail. The axle spun up into a silver blur, and the chains rose into the air, then descended as the driver eased the Sherman forward at barely 2 miles per hour. The rotating chains slammed into the ground, beating the earth with incredible force. Dirt erupted upward with each strike. Then the first mine detonated. A massive explosion lifted a column of smoke and fragments into the air. For a moment, no one could see the tank through the blast. When the smoke drifted, the Sherman was still moving, the chains were still spinning, the mechanism had held. Then a second mine went off, followed by a third and a fourth. The tank continued crawling forward through the churning haze as blast after blast shook the air. The sound was overwhelming, even at 50 yards, a pounding mixture of the engine, the flail roar, and thunderous mines detonating in rapid sequence. Marines stared in disbelief. The machine was working exactly as Niemann had imagined. The Joker reached 30 yards into the minefield, then 35, then 40. Once clear of the final row of buried charges, the driver shut down the flail. The chains slowed and hung motionless once more. As the dust settled, Marines rushed toward the vehicle, cheering and shouting. But their excitement faded when Johnston stepped out and examined the differential housing. A jagged piece of shrapnel about the size of a thumb had pierced the underside of the differential armor. The differential itself still turned freely, but the thin sheet metal casing around it had been punctured. In real combat, a hit like that could destroy the mechanism and leave the tank immobilized in a live minefield. The flaw was serious, and it had to be fixed. Shaw and the Seabees wasted no time. Without waiting for orders, they dragged heavy steel plates from the workshop and began cutting and welding. Sparks rained across the motor pool as they built an armored box around the entire differential assembly using 1/4-inch steel plate, thick enough to repel most fragments. The work took 2 full days, and when they finished, the differential looked like a fortified steel cube. 4 days later, they conducted a second live test, another minefield laid out across an open stretch of ground, another slow advance with the flail spinning, another series of violent blasts. This time, when Johnston inspected the armor, he found fresh impact marks scattered across the plates, yet not a single penetration. The added armor had solved the vulnerability. With that success, Niemann wrote a detailed report for battalion headquarters describing both tests and the performance of the flail. The Joker had cleared 2 full minefields in less than 5 minutes total, without exposing engineers to danger and without any damage to the essential mechanism. The battalion commander approved moving forward, and the division scheduled a major demonstration for late December. High-ranking officers from across the 4th Marine Division would attend along with artillery commanders, infantry leaders, logistics planners, and even observers from the United States Army. This demonstration would determine whether the flail was simply a curiosity or a weapon worthy of deployment to Iwo Jima. Niemann spent the remaining days checking every component. The chains were examined link by link. The drive system was tested repeatedly. Johnston practiced the controls until he could work them with absolute precision. They all knew the upcoming demonstration would decide the fate of the entire project, and possibly the fate of many Marines who would soon fight across the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific. On the morning of December 28th, the air over the Maui training grounds was clear and warm as Niemann arrived at the demonstration site at 0700 to oversee the final preparations for the most important test of the flail tank. Rows of chairs had been set out for the senior officers who would soon arrive, and the minefield had been carefully prepared by Marine engineers using genuine captured Japanese mines, placed with the same spacing and depth expected on Iwo Jima. The Joker sat ready with a fresh coat of paint covering the worst scars from Saipan, and its chains hung motionless over the ground like the claws of some dormant creature. Everything looked perfect except for one disaster that no one had predicted. Johnston, the man who had built the entire mechanism and who was supposed to operate it during the demonstration, was nowhere to be seen. Marines searched frantically until they found him in his tent, barely conscious and absolutely drunk after spending the entire night drinking. No amount of shouting or cold water could make him ready in 30 minutes. Niemann understood at once that he needed another operator, someone who had never touched the controls and would have to learn in minutes what Johnston had learned through weeks of trial and error. He pulled aside the first qualified tank crewman he could find, a corporal from a company who had driven Shermans since Roy Nama. Niemann gave him a 10-minute crash course on the flail controls, showing him the engagement lever, the speed lever, and how to raise and lower the hydraulic arms. The corporal listened carefully, and though he had never operated this exact mechanism, he seemed steady enough to trust. Senior officers began arriving at 0745. 2 full colonels, 3 lieutenant colonels, a major general, and many others representing infantry, artillery engineers, and logistics. Around 30 high-ranking observers took their seats looking toward the strange machine that stood at the edge of the minefield. Most had heard rumors about an improvised device built from scrap parts. Some looked doubtful while others seemed curious. At 0800 sharp, Niemann stepped forward and delivered his briefing. He described the mine threat on SAPE, and the 23 tanks lost in the first week, the slow pace of engineer clearing teams, and the constant danger of tanks outstripping safe lanes. He explained the idea behind the flail, the scavenged parts, the Jeep transmission, the truck, axle, the chains, the armor added after the first test. He kept his explanation brief, focused, and honest without exaggeration. Then he stepped back and signaled the replacement driver to begin. The Sherman engine rumbled to life. The corporal engaged the flail. The axle spun and the chains lifted from the ground, forming a whirling circle of steel. The driver eased the tank forward at a measured pace, and within seconds the first buried mine detonated. A huge plume of ash and smoke erupted in front of the vehicle. Officers in the front row leaned forward in their seats as the tank kept moving with the chains still tearing into the earth. The second explosion followed almost immediately, then a third and a fourth. The smoke thickened until the tank was completely hidden from view, yet the sound of the engine and the steady roar of the spinning chains continued uninterrupted. Blast after blast shook the air as the flail located and destroyed every mine in its path. The demonstration lasted barely 40 seconds. Then the Sherman emerged from the far side of the minefield, still moving and still fully functional. The corporal shut down the flail and the chains slowly wound down to a standstill. The major general rose from his seat and walked forward, and the other officers followed. They examined the chains, the differential armor, the hydraulic arms, and the frontal driveshaft that Johnston had installed through the armor plate. Fresh shrapnel marks scarred the steel casing, but nothing had penetrated. The officers asked questions about maintenance, spare parts, chain replacement, and fuel strain. Niemann answered each with confidence. When the inspection ended, the senior officers stepped aside to speak privately. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes. Then the Major General turned to Niemann and asked how many such vehicles could be ready before February. Niemann told him they only had one, and that building more would require authorization to modify additional Shermans and access to more salvage parts. The general stated that he would arrange both. The division approved immediate deployment of the flail tank for the upcoming invasion of Iwo Jima. If it performed well in combat, more would be built. The assault date had already been set for February 19th in the year 1945, and the clock was now ticking. Over the following weeks, the 4th Marine Division prepared for the coming operation. Intelligence described Iwo Jima as an island of volcanic rock, covering 8 square miles dominated by Mount Suribachi at the southern end, with 3 airfields stretching along the center. An estimated 21,000 Japanese defenders had fortified the island with tunnels, blockhouses, gun positions, artillery caves, and dense minefields. The 4th Tank Battalion would play a critical role in supporting infantry assaults and breaching those defenses. The flail tank was assigned to 2nd Platoon of C Company, and Sergeant Rick Haydex was selected to command it. Haydex was an experienced tank commander who had fought on Saipan and Tinian, and who had practiced the flail controls with Johnston before deployment. The flail tank presented a logistical challenge because it was the only diesel-powered Sherman in the battalion, which now consisted mostly of gasoline-powered M4A3 tanks. This meant separate fuel stores and unique maintenance demands. Still, the battalion accepted the burden because the flail offered something no other tank could provide: a way to clear mines under fire and open lanes for Marines who would soon step onto the most dangerous battlefield of the Pacific War. The invasion force began loading in late January, and by the time the 4th Marine Division sailed from Maui, The flail tank sat secured inside the hold of a landing ship tank alongside the rest of C Company's Shermans, waiting for the battle that would decide whether all the work done on Maui had been worth the effort. The voyage to Iwo Jima lasted nearly 3 weeks, with short stops along the route, including Saipan, where final supplies were taken aboard. Throughout the trip, Sergeant Rick Haydex studied every detail of the flail mechanism, practicing its operation in the cramped hold, while Johnston, now sober and focused, explained the limits of each component and the maintenance requirements that would keep it functional once ashore. At dawn on February 19th in the year 1945, the assault on Iwo Jima began. At 0640, a massive naval bombardment opened with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers firing thousands of shells at the island. Carrier aircraft struck inland positions, and the sea shook with the concussion of each blast. The bombardment was supposed to break the Japanese defenses, but Kurabayashi had ordered his men to remain hidden deep in the tunnel networks until the Americans landed. When the first Marine waves hit the beaches at 0900, they met almost no resistance. It seemed too easy, and it was. The beach sand turned out to be a nightmare. The volcanic ash was soft and deep, and it swallowed the feet of infantrymen and the tracks of tanks. Some landing craft could barely reach the shoreline, and Marines had to wade through surf while carrying heavy equipment. The 4th Tank Battalion began landing at 0930, and Sherman after Sherman rolled off the ramps into the surf and churned toward the beach. Many became bogged down within seconds, tracks spun helplessly, and the 30-ton tanks sank into ash that offered no support. The flail tank landed at roughly 10:15 with Haydex in command. The extra weight of the flail assembly dragged the bow deeper into the soft sand, but that same weight also helped give the front end better stability as the tank fought to climb free of the surf. Inch by inch, the flail tank forced its way up the beach. By noon 23, Shermans from the battalion were ashore, although 8 remained stuck in the deep ash while engineers attempted to dig them out. 15 tanks, including the flail, were operational and began pushing inland toward airfield number 1/2 a mile ahead. Japanese artillery finally broke its silence and began striking the beaches with precision. Mortar rounds fell among the tanks and infantry. Shell bursts tore black craters in the ash, and shrapnel hissed through the air. Still, the Marines advanced because they had no choice. The volcanic ash made every step and every yard a struggle. C Company moved forward with infantry screening ahead, and engineers sweeping for mines with metal detectors, but the progress was painfully slow. The ground rose in gentle slopes toward the first airfield, and on all sides the terrain looked barren and lifeless, with no vegetation and no natural cover. Japanese positions were hidden inside expertly camouflaged bunkers and caves with gun ports concealed behind rocks. Fire came from directions no one could see. Marines fell to machine gun fire or mortar fragments, yet the line kept moving because stopping meant death. Haydex kept the flail tank with the lead elements of C Company. So far, there were no confirmed minefields, but intelligence had warned that the Japanese had laid many, and the question was not whether the Marines would find one but when. Around 1400 hours, C Company reached within roughly 400 yards of airfield number 1. The strip stretched across the volcanic plain, scarred by explosions. Japanese aircraft had been withdrawn long before the invasion, but the airfield remained a crucial objective that American forces needed to secure. As the tanks and infantry advanced, Haydex noticed a series of small red flags planted in the ground 50 yards ahead near the southern edge of the airfield. The flags formed a straight line perpendicular to his route. His training told him that flags usually marked hazards such as minefields, wire trenches, or important directional points. These flags looked like deliberate markers, and Haydex believed they indicated a Japanese mine barrier. He radioed his platoon commander requesting permission to activate the flail and clear a lane through what he assumed was a minefield. Permission was granted. Haydex ordered the bow gunner to prepare the flail. The gunner engaged the drive shaft and the axle spun up to speed. The chains lifted as they gained rotation, and the flail roared like a metal tornado. What Haydex did not know was that the red flags did not mark mines at all. They were range markers for Japanese heavy mortars positioned on higher ground, roughly 500 yards to the north. Kuribayashi's defenders had pre-registered every yard of the battlefield, and those flags helped mortar crews adjust their fire with deadly accuracy. As soon as the flail tank moved toward the flags, Japanese observers reported the target. The first mortar round landed 20 yards short, sending a burst of ash into the air. Haydex saw it and ordered the driver to speed up to clear the supposed minefield faster. The second round landed 10 yards closer. The third round detonated barely 5 feet in front of the tank, cracking the driver's periscope and spraying fragments across the hull. Then a barrage began. Multiple mortar teams fired simultaneously, and the flail tank was suddenly engulfed in explosions. Haydex ordered the driver to reverse, but the tracks spun uselessly in the soft ash. The front end of the Sherman sank deeper because of the extra weight of the flail. They were stuck. Haydex shut down the flail, hoping to lighten the front, but it made no difference. Mortar rounds kept falling around them, and fragments hammered the armor again and again. The crew braced inside the tank as each blast shook the hull. They were alive but trapped and completely exposed in the middle of an open killing ground. The flail tank remained trapped under the growing mortar barrage, its tracks buried in the shifting volcanic ash, and its crew fighting to stay calm as each explosion rattled the armor and filled the interior with dust shaken loose from every seam. The shockwaves traveled through the steel hull like hammer blows, and the crew could feel each blast through the floor plates, but the tank still held together. Haydex knew that if they stayed where they were, the enemy would eventually land a perfectly placed round or a direct hit from a heavier weapon that would destroy the flail and kill everyone inside. The bow gunner tried once more to engage the flail, but the chains could not bite into the soft ash enough to help pull the tank free. The driver pushed the engine to its limit, but the tracks had no traction at all, and instead the tank only sank deeper. From the outside, it would have looked as if the volcanic sand was swallowing the Sherman whole. Haydex reported their situation over the radio and requested immediate assistance because the crew could not escape on foot with such an intense curtain of mortar fire falling on every side. Another Sherman from C Company responded to the call and moved forward despite the danger. The supporting tank crew knew the risk because Japanese observers would quickly adjust fire toward any vehicle approaching the trapped flail. Still, they continued closing the distance, bouncing across shell holes and fighting the same treacherous ash that had immobilized the flail. The supporting crew managed to halt close enough to throw a tow cable, and Haydex ordered his men to secure it to the flail tank's rear towing points. Fragments struck both vehicles as mortar rounds continued to fall, but the Marines worked with steady hands because their survival depended on the tow succeeding. Once the cable was attached, the assisting Sherman reversed with all the power its engine could produce. At first, nothing happened. The flail tank remained stubbornly rooted in place, as if anchored by the ash itself. Then slowly, the tracks began to lift from the deep pockets of volcanic sand. Inch by inch, the larger vehicle started to move backward, grinding through the ash with agonizing slowness, while the supporting tank strained under the weight. For 20 minutes, they worked under relentless mortar fire, with explosions shaking the ground and showering both tanks with ash. Finally, the flail tank broke free, and the assisting Sherman pulled it back toward a shallow rise that offered a small amount of cover. Only when they were behind that low ridge did the mortar fire begin to shift away in search of new targets. When the flail tank settled into a relatively safe position, Haydex and his crew inspected the machine from inside. Periscopes were cracked and paint was scorched, and the hull carried dozens of fresh fragment scars, but the armor had held. They climbed out only when the immediate barrage had passed, and they examined the full extent of the damage. The flail mechanism was still intact, and the chains, although battered, remained attached. Yet Haydex understood at once that the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima had defeated the machine in a way the minefields of Saipan never had. The flail tank needed firm ground to move forward while beating the soil ahead of it, and on Saip, and the dirt had been solid enough for the Sherman to maintain traction. On Iwo Jima, the ash was so fine and deep that even ordinary Shermans struggled to move. With the added weight of the flail assembly in front, the tank became nose-heavy and far more likely to sink. That vulnerability combined with the violent mortar fire meant the flail had little chance of performing the job it had been designed to do. The mission had lasted less than 30 minutes, and although the crew had survived, the outcome made it clear that the flail would not be able to operate effectively on this island. Japanese defenders had placed most of their mines farther inland, where the ash grew even deeper, and any attempt to use the flail in those areas would have left the tank stuck once again and exposed to even heavier fire. For that reason, the flail tank was withdrawn from frontline operations and reassigned to a safe position where it remained for the rest of the battle. Meanwhile, infantry engineers continued clearing mines by hand using metal detectors while crawling under enemy fire to find each buried charge. It was slower and more dangerous, but under the conditions of Iwo Jima, it proved more practical than the flail concept. The battle for the island raged on for 36 days. As the Marines pushed inland, they faced interconnected tunnels, machine gun nests, hidden artillery, and defenders who had no intention of surrendering. By the time American forces declared Iwo Jima secure on March 26, 1945, nearly 7,000 Marines had been killed and another 20,000 wounded. Japanese casualties were devastating, with more than 98% of the garrison fighting to the death, and only 216 prisoners taken alive out of an estimated 21,000 soldiers who had defended the island. The battle produced 27 Medals of Honor, more than any other single battle in American history. Admiral Chester Nimitz famously stated that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Major Niemann survived the battle and continued to lead tanks during the final months of the war, including occupation duty in North China. He received the Navy Cross for his actions on Saipan, where he had switched tanks twice under heavy fire, and continued the attack despite multiple hits and mounting losses. He left the Marine Corps in 1946, and later built a successful career as a lumber retailer. He lived a long life and passed away in 2003 at the age of 91. Although the flail tank he had created from scrap metal never achieved the combat success he had hoped, for the design itself was sound. American forces later built additional flail vehicles in preparation for the planned invasion of mainland Japan. Those operations were cancelled after the atomic bombs ended the war, but the concept survived. Modern mine clearing vehicles still use rotating flails based on the same principle improvised by Neiman Johnston and Shaw in a simple motor pool on Maui. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, the 4th Tank Battalion lost 33 Shermans, some to mines, but most to anti-tank guns, artillery, and the brutal nature of the terrain. Yet the battalion never hesitated and continued to support the infantry, destroying fortifications and pushing forward, even when instinct told every Marine to stop, because that was the mission and that was the price of victory. When the battle for Iwo Jima ended and the island was finally declared secure, the men of the 4th Marine Division were exhausted, scarred, and forever changed by what they had witnessed, because no other battlefield in the Pacific matched the relentless brutality of that place, where every ridge, every cave, and every shattered bunker had cost blood to take. For the tankers of the 4th Tank Battalion, the struggle had been a test of endurance against an enemy who had prepared the island for months, turning it into a fortress of lava rock tunnels and fortified chambers that swallowed shells and spat fire back at the Marines. The flail tank that Major Neiman had created from junked vehicles did not return to combat after its rescue from the volcanic ash, because the terrain had denied it the ground it needed to function, and the battalion commanders accepted that the machine, though built with courage and ingenuity, could not overcome the natural design of Iwo Jima. Still, the story of the flail tank did not end there, because its brief appearance on the island sparked discussions across the division about how future mine-clearing vehicles might be built, and how engineering improvisation could save lives in battles to come. Engineers, infantrymen, and tankers who had seen the machine on Maui, or during its short mission on Iwo Jima, spoke about the courage it took to drive such an experimental weapon into the heart of enemy fire, and how the idea itself embodied the resourcefulness of Marines who refused to accept impossible odds. The flail tank sat behind the lines for the remainder of the battle, its chains hanging silent, its frame coated with ash and shrapnel scars, a reminder of the desperate need to adapt when conventional tools fail. While the flail tank awaited orders that never came, the war around it intensified as Marines pushed deeper into the labyrinth of Kurabayashi's defenses. Flamethrower teams cleared bunkers, demolition men blasted cave entrances. Infantry squads fought yard by yard against defenders who almost never surrendered. Tanks advanced wherever the ground allowed, firing at cave mouths, blockhouses, and fortified shells of structures that still hid machine gun positions. The 4th Tank Battalion had arrived on the island with 39 Shermans, and by the end of the battle, 33 had been lost either to direct enemy fire or the treacherous ground itself. Tank crews often fought without infantry support because the ash slowed movement and communication broke down under smoke, gunfire, and constant artillery. Yet the battalion continued forward because Marines depended on their armor to silence the positions that pinned them down. Amid this chaos, Major Neiman moved with the battalion, advising commanders, monitoring tank losses, and coordinating actions as the terrain forced units to adapt their tactics. Though he never expected to use the flail again on Iwo Jima, he watched it closely, knowing that the concept might still prove vital in later operations. When the battle finally ended on March 26, 1945, the cost was staggering. Nearly 7,000 Marines had died and 20,000 were wounded, and the island itself was a charred landscape of black sand, twisted steel, and shattered rock. Yet from this devastation, a kind of legend emerged. 27 Marines and sailors received the Medal of Honor for their actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other single battle in American history, and Admiral Chester Nimitz stated that on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. This statement captured not only the courage of infantrymen who stormed machine gun nests, but also the spirit of those who fought from inside tanks, including the men who had tested the flail under live fire, and those who had risked their lives to rescue it from the mortar barrage. After the island was secure, the flail tank was loaded aboard a ship along with the remaining Shermans of the battalion. It traveled with the division during the final months of the war, though it never again saw combat. Major Neiman continued serving with the tank battalion during these months, directing maintenance assessments, supporting occupation duties in North China, and helping prepare the battalion for further operations in case the war extended into an invasion of mainland Japan. Engineers in both the Marine Corps and the Army studied Neiman's improvised machine during this time, recognizing that the basic principle of rotating chains to clear mines could be refined and expanded. They began planning for more advanced flail tanks for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, where minefields were expected to be far more extensive than anything encountered in the Pacific up to that point. Dozens of flail tanks were prepared for that operation, but the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war before the machines could be tested in combat. In the years that followed, Major Neiman left the Marine Corps in 1946 and entered civilian life, building a successful career as a lumber retailer while raising a family and reflecting on the war that had shaped his life. He lived to see the world change through decades of peace and conflict, and when he passed away in 2003 at the age of 91, he left behind the legacy of a Marine who refused to let an impossible problem go unanswered. Johnston, the mechanic who had built the flail mechanism, also lived to see the war end and carried with him the pride of having crafted something that, though limited by circumstance, represented the raw ingenuity Marines often rely on. Shaw, who had shaped the armored plates that protected the differential, continued working in armored maintenance after the war, passing on his experience to younger Marines. Their improvised tank did not transform the Battle of Iwo Jima, but it influenced future engineering designs and proved that innovation often begins with a single idea and a willingness to attempt the impossible. Modern mine-clearing vehicles used in conflicts around the world still employ rotating flails striking the earth ahead of them with heavy chains to detonate hidden charges, a direct descendant of the machine first built in a dusty motor pool on Maui. Though the flail tank of C Company served only briefly, its story remains part of the broader history of Marines who fought across the Pacific and who met every challenge with determination, resilience, and the belief that no obstacle was too great to overcome. When the war finally ended and the guns across the Pacific fell silent, the story of Major Robert Nieman and his improvised flail tank slowly faded into the background of a much larger history, yet the truth remained that the machine he built from salvaged parts had embodied the resourcefulness, determination that defined the Marines who fought through the islands of the Pacific. The flail itself never became the decisive battlefield weapon Nieman had hoped for because the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima denied it the ground it needed, and Japanese firepower forced it out of action before it could prove its full capability. Still, the idea behind it was stronger than the outcome of that single mission because the concept of rotating chains to detonate mines before they reached a vehicle proved so effective in principle that American planners soon prepared dozens of improved flail tanks for the invasion of mainland Japan. Those vehicles were refined versions of the Joker, designed to clear the massive minefields that American intelligence believed awaited landing forces. They never saw use because the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced Japan to surrender, but the machines remained a testament to Nieman's vision. As the years passed, the Marine Corps recorded the battles that shaped its legacy, and among those accounts, the flail tank appeared as a small but meaningful note in the long story of the 4th Tank Battalion. Veterans who had watched the tests on Maui remembered the roar of the spinning chains and the explosions that shook the training grounds. They remembered the sight of the Joker pushing through smoke and debris as Japanese mines detonated harmlessly ahead of it during those early experiments. They remembered how men who had fought on Saipan and Tinian stood at the edge of the test field, almost unbelieving as the chains kept turning, and the tank kept crawling through blasts powerful enough to cripple any ordinary Sherman. These memories carried forward into reunions and quiet conversations decades later, as old Marines recalled the strange machine built by a major who refused to let mines tear apart his battalion without a fight. They spoke of the dedication of Johnston, whose mechanical skill had shaped the heart of the flail. They spoke of Shaw, who welded thick armor plates with hands that had repaired dozens of tanks in the darkest days of the war. They spoke of the young corporal who operated the flail during the demonstration, after Johnston had drunk himself into a stupor, and who, despite never having used the controls, guided the tank across a field of live explosives without hesitation. They even spoke about the day the flail became trapped on Iwo Jima when mortar rounds hammered its hull and when another Sherman risked destruction to tow it free. These recollections were not told with regret, but with admiration, because everyone understood that courage did not always appear in the form of medals or famous moments. Sometimes it appeared as an idea drawn in pencil on a scrap of paper inside a company tent. Sometimes it appeared as a mechanic cutting a hole through Sherman armor because he believed it might save lives. Sometimes it appeared as a tank crew pushing into the heart of enemy fire because they were ordered to try something new that had never been tested in real combat. Major Nieman carried these experiences with him when he returned home after the war. He built a life, built a career, and raised a family while remaining quietly proud of the Marines he had served with, and the moments that had defined him on Saipan Tinian and Iwo Jima. He never claimed to be a hero, even though he had earned the Navy Cross for switching tanks twice under fire and continuing the assault while shells and bullets smashed into armored steel around him. In his later years, he spoke rarely about his wartime experiences, but when he did, he emphasized the men who fought beside him, the mechanics who fixed tanks in impossible conditions, and the young Marines who drove Shermans into landscapes filled with hidden mines artillery and well-planned ambushes. When he passed away in the year 2003 at the age of 91, the Marine Corps remembered him as one of the many officers who had shaped the course of the Pacific War through innovation, courage, and unwavering commitment to his men. The flail tank he built existed now only in photographs, dusty reports, and the memories of those who witnessed it in motion. Yet its legacy lived on because modern military engineers across multiple nations still relied on the same principle Neiman had improvised in a motor pool on Maui. Modern flails used rotating drums' heavy chains and reinforced housings to beat the ground ahead of them and detonate any buried threats. Whether clearing minefields in deserts, forests, farmlands, or war-torn cities, these machines continued to carry the DNA of the Joker, the same spirit of practical ingenuity born from the pressure of war. The 4th Tank Battalion carried its own enduring legacy as well. During the Battle of Iwo Jima, the battalion lost 33 Shermans and many brave tankers, but the unit never faltered and never retreated because their mission was to support the infantry no matter the cost. They destroyed fortifications, fired point-blank into caves, and pushed ahead even when the ground shifted beneath them and when artillery exploded around them. Their actions became woven into the wider story of Iwo Jima, where uncommon valor became common virtue, as Admiral Nimitz declared. And so the story of the flail tank became part of that larger tapestry, a reminder that innovation does not always come from laboratories, factories, or official directives. Sometimes it comes from a battlefield, need from a creative mind, willing to take risks, and from Marines who believe that saving even a single life is worth every ounce of effort. In the end, the flail tank did not change the outcome of Iwo Jima, but it changed the way military engineers approached mine-clearing technology for generations. It demonstrated that the Marines who fought in the Pacific were not only warriors, but inventors, problem solvers, and fighters, who never stopped seeking a way to overcome the obstacles before them. And because of that, the story of Major Robert Neiman and the tank he built from junk continues to live on in the legacy of every flail vehicle used today in conflicts around the world, and in the memory of the men who refused to surrender to the dangers beneath their feet. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.